Every king needs a queen. But what happens when the queen he ignores becomes the one person his entire kingdom learns to love? Some say power lives in bloodlines. Others believe it rests in gold, or land, or the sharp edge of a sword. But in the spring of 1814, when Duke Nathaniel Ashford stood before the altar and placed a ring on Lady Vivienne Hale's finger, he learned that real power often hides in the shadows we create ourselves. He just didn't know it yet. He wouldn't understand it for years. And by the time truth finally arrived at his door, it would be far too late to undo the damage. This is not a fairy tale. This is the story of a man who had everything and chose to destroy it with his own hands. And if you stay with me until the very end, you'll see how the cruelest prisons are the ones we build inside our own hearts. The wedding was flawless. That was the problem. Vivienne Hale walked down the aisle of Westminster Cathedral wearing white silk that cost more than most families would earn in a lifetime, her veil trailing behind her like a river of broken promises. Outside, crowds gathered along the cobblestone streets, waving flags and shouting blessings toward the cathedral doors. Inside, organ music swelled through vaulted ceilings, while England's most powerful families watched from gilded pews, their faces carefully neutral, their thoughts carefully hidden. Nathaniel stood at the altar and did not smile. He watched her approach with the same expression he might use while reviewing estate ledgers or inspecting livestock. His jaw was tight. His shoulders were rigid beneath the military dress uniform that showcased medals he'd never actually earned in battle. When she reached him, he did not offer his hand. He simply waited, eyes forward, as though she were late to an appointment she'd never requested. The archbishop spoke in Latin, his voice echoing through the cathedral like distant thunder. Nathaniel repeated the vows without inflection, each word delivered with the mechanical precision of a man reading a legal contract. When it came time to place the ring on her finger, his touch lasted less than a second. Cold, clinical, transactional. Vivienne did not flinch. She had learned long ago not to expect warmth from stones. The reception took place in the Ashford family estate, a sprawling monument to inherited wealth that sat on 300 acres of perfectly manicured grounds. Servants in white gloves carried trays of champagne through ballrooms where chandeliers dripped crystal light onto marble floors. Politicians laughed too loudly. Noble women whispered behind fans. Foreign ambassadors made toasts in languages most guests didn't understand but applauded anyway. Nathaniel spent the entire evening on the opposite side of the room from his new wife. He stood near the West Terrace with a circle of men who smelled like cigar smoke and old money, discussing trade routes and parliamentary votes and which racehorses were worth betting on that season. Every so often, someone would glance toward Vivienne and make a comment Nathaniel pretended not to hear. He'd nod, sip his brandy, change the subject. Vivienne sat alone near the grand piano, her hands folded in her lap, watching the celebration unfold around her like a play she hadn't been cast in. Occasionally, a guest would approach to offer congratulations, and she would smile politely, thank them with perfect diction, and watch them walk away as quickly as they'd arrived. No one stayed long. No one asked her to dance. No one seemed to notice when she quietly excused herself and disappeared into the gardens shortly after midnight. She stood beneath an oak tree older than the estate itself, staring up at a sky too polluted by London's coal smoke to reveal any stars. Her wedding dress felt like a costume now. The diamond necklace around her throat felt like a noose. She thought about her mother, who had died when Vivienne was 12, and wondered if this was what marriage had felt like for her too. A performance, a transaction, a slow burial beneath expectations she never asked to carry. Behind her, footsteps crunched against gravel. She turned, half expecting to see Nathaniel. Instead, it was Lord Pembroke, one of his closest friends, a man with a reputation for gambling away family fortunes and sleeping with other men's wives. Pembroke smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You should return to the ballroom," he said. "People are starting to talk." "Let them," Vivienne replied quietly. He studied her for a moment, then shrugged. "Suit yourself. But if I were you, I'd get used to being alone. Nathaniel doesn't do affection, never has, probably never will." "Then why did he marry me?" Pembroke laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the night air like broken glass. "Politics, darling. Your father controls half of Parliament. Nathaniel controls the other half. Together, your families could reshape England. That's what this is. A merger. Don't mistake it for anything romantic." He walked away before she could respond. Vivienne stood there for a long time, listening to music drift through the open ballroom windows, feeling the weight of a future she couldn't escape pressing down on her chest like a stone. The first 3 months of marriage passed in near silence. Nathaniel kept separate bedrooms, separate schedules, separate lives. He would leave before dawn to ride horses or meet with estate managers or disappear into London for days without explanation. When he returned, he rarely acknowledged her presence. If they happened to cross paths in the hallways, he would nod once and keep walking. If servants asked about dinner arrangements, he would tell them to serve the Duchess separately. Vivienne tried at first to build some kind of bridge between them. She would wait for him in the library with tea prepared exactly how he preferred it, only to watch it grow cold while he never appeared. She would ask the housekeeper about his favorite meals and request the kitchen prepare them, only to learn he'd eaten at his club in town. She left books on his desk that she thought he might enjoy, carefully selected based on passing comments she'd overheard him make. He never opened them. One evening, after he'd returned from a week-long trip to Scotland, she knocked softly on his study door. "Come in," he said, not looking up from the papers spread across his desk. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I thought we might dine together tonight. I've already eaten. Then perhaps we could talk." "About what?" She hesitated. "About anything. About your trip, about the estate, about us." Finally, he looked up. His eyes were cold, gray, empty. "There is no us, Vivienne. There's a legal arrangement that benefits both our families. That's all this is. That's all it will ever be. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for both of us." The words landed like a slap. She stood there frozen, searching his face for any trace of regret or hesitation. There was none. Just cold indifference, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who'd never had to consider anyone's pain but his own. "I see," she said quietly. "Good. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to finish." She left without another word. That night, she cried for the last time. Not because she loved him, she barely knew him, but because she finally understood the shape of her prison. She had been sold into a gilded cage, and the man holding the key had no intention of ever letting her out. But Vivienne Hale had survived worse than neglect. She had survived her mother's death, her father's emotional absence, years of being paraded through ballrooms like livestock at auction, valued only for her bloodline and dowry. She had learned long ago that survival required adaptation, and if Nathaniel would not let her be his wife, then she would find another purpose entirely. She just didn't know yet what that purpose would be. Everything changed when Lady Celeste Whitmore returned from Paris. It was late autumn when rumors first began circulating through London's social circles. Celeste had spent 2 years in France, ostensibly studying art and language, but everyone knew the real reason she'd fled England. She had been Nathaniel's mistress before his engagement to Vivienne. Some claimed she'd been the love of his life. Others whispered darker things, that she'd broken his heart, or that he'd broken hers, or that their affair had been so scandalous even his family's wealth couldn't protect them from consequences. Whatever the truth, her return sent shockwaves through high society. Vivienne first heard the news from her lady's maid, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret, who had a talent for collecting gossip the way other people collected coins. "They say she's even more beautiful than before," Margaret said, helping Vivienne into her evening gown. "They say half the men in Paris fell in love with her. They say she came back because she heard the Duke was married and wanted to see for herself." Vivienne said nothing. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, pale skin, dark hair pulled into an elegant knot, a face that had been called lovely but never stunning. She wondered if Celeste looked the way Nathaniel wished she did. The first time Vivienne saw them together was at the Chamberlain Ball, one of the season's most prestigious events. She had arrived with Nathaniel in separate carriages, as usual. He'd barely glanced at her before disappearing into the crowd. She'd spent the first hour making polite conversation with elderly dowagers and bored diplomats, smiling until her cheeks ached. Then she saw him. He was standing near the fountain in the center ballroom, and he was smiling, actually smiling. His whole face had transformed, softened, opened, come alive in a way Vivienne had never seen. And beside him stood the most breathtaking woman she'd ever laid eyes on. Celeste Whitmore was tall and golden, with honey-colored hair that caught the candlelight and skin that seemed to glow from within. She wore a gown the color of midnight, cut low enough to be scandalous, but not quite low enough to be improper. Men stared, women glared, and Nathaniel looked at her like she was the only person in the room. Vivienne watched as he offered Celeste his arm, watched as they moved onto the dance floor together, their bodies fitting perfectly as the orchestra began a waltz. Watched as he leaned close to whisper something in her ear, and she threw back her head and laughed, a sound so full of joy it seemed to light up the entire ballroom. He had never offered Vivienne his arm, had never danced with her, had never made her laugh. Around her she could feel the shift in the room's energy. People were staring now, not at Nathaniel and Celeste, but at her. The forgotten wife, the humiliated Duchess, the woman whose husband would rather be with someone else. "Lady Ashford," a voice said beside her. She turned to find Lord Pembroke again, holding 2 glasses of champagne. He offered her one with a sympathetic smile that made her want to slap him. "Quite the spectacle, isn't it?" he said. "I wouldn't know what you mean. Come now. Everyone in this room is watching your husband make a fool of himself over his former mistress. The least you can do is pretend you don't care." "I don't care, liar." She took the champagne and drank half of it in one swallow. "What would you have me do, Lord Pembroke? Make a scene? Cry? Beg him to remember he has a wife?" Pembroke shrugged. "Some women would. I am not some women." "No," he said quietly. "I'm beginning to see that." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and hollow conversations. Vivienne watched Nathaniel dance 3 more waltzes with Celeste, watched him fetch her champagne, watched him laugh at her jokes and touch her hand and look at her with an expression that could only be described as devotion. When it was finally time to leave, Nathaniel didn't even bother pretending. He left with Celeste on his arm, helping her into his personal carriage while Vivienne stood on the steps and watched them drive away together into the London fog. She rode home alone that night, sitting in the darkness of her separate carriage, listening to the horse's hooves echo against cobblestones. The humiliation should have destroyed her. The gossip that would follow should have crushed her. But somewhere between the ballroom and the estate, something inside Vivienne Hale began to harden into something sharper than pain. If Nathaniel wanted to parade his mistress through London, let him. If society wanted to mock her as the forgotten Duchess, let them. She would not beg for scraps of affection from a man who had none to give. She would not waste her life waiting for him to notice her. She would find her own purpose, her own meaning, her own way to matter. She just had no idea how far that decision would take her. The gossip exploded overnight. By the following morning, every household in London was discussing the scandal. Servants whispered in kitchens. Ladies murmured behind fans at breakfast gatherings. Newspapers printed carefully worded editorials that danced around the truth without quite naming names, but everyone knew exactly who they meant. "The Duke of Ashford has rekindled an old flame," one columnist wrote. "One wonders what his young bride thinks of this arrangement." Vivienne stopped reading after the 3rd article. There was no point. The damage was done. What made it worse was that Nathaniel didn't even try to hide it. Within days, he was escorting Celeste to every major event in the city: the theater, the opera, parliamentary dinners, gallery openings. Always with Celeste on his arm, glittering and perfect, while Vivienne remained at home or attended separately, a ghost haunting the edges of her own marriage. At one particularly brutal dinner hosted by the Foreign Secretary, Vivienne arrived to find that Nathaniel had seated Celeste in the place of honor traditionally reserved for the Duke's wife. Celeste sat at his right hand, laughing and charming every diplomat at the table, while Vivienne was placed near the far end, wedged between a deaf earl and a visiting German count who spoke no English. She endured the entire meal in silence, cutting her food into smaller and smaller pieces she never ate, smiling when required, nodding at appropriate moments. Inside, she felt herself fragmenting, breaking apart into pieces she wasn't sure how to put back together. After dinner, as guests mingled in the drawing room, she overheard 2 young women talking near the fireplace. "I almost feel sorry for her," the first one said. "Don't," the second replied. She knew what she was getting into. Everyone knows Nathaniel's only loved one woman his entire life, and it certainly isn't his wife. Still, it must be humiliating to be replaced before the marriage even begins. Well, what did she expect? She's pretty enough, I suppose, but she's so dull. No wonder he prefers Celeste. At least Celeste knows how to make a man feel alive. Vivienne set down her glass very carefully and walked out of the room before anyone could see her face. She found herself in the mansion's private library, a space rarely used during parties. She stood in the darkness, pressing her palms against the cool wood of a bookshelf, trying to breathe through the tightness in her chest. The door opened behind her. She turned, expecting a servant. Instead, it was Celeste. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Celeste closed the door and leaned against it, studying Vivienne with an expression that was difficult to read. Not cruel exactly. Not kind either. Just curious. "You're the wife," Celeste said finally. "I am. You're younger than I expected. Is that supposed to be a compliment?" Celeste smiled slightly. "I haven't decided yet." She crossed the room and poured herself a brandy from the decanter on the side table, moving through the space with the easy confidence of someone who'd been here before. Probably had been here before, Vivienne realized. Probably in this very room. With Nathaniel. "He talks about you sometimes," Celeste said. "Does he?" "Not in the way you'd hope. He talks about you the way men talk about obligations, duties, things they have to manage but don't particularly enjoy managing." The words were designed to hurt, and they succeeded. But Vivienne had learned in recent weeks that pain could be useful if you didn't let it consume you. She straightened her spine and met Celeste's gaze directly. "Why are you telling me this?" Celeste tilted her head. "Because I want you to understand something. Nathaniel will never love you. He's incapable of it. Oh, he'll perform the role of husband when necessary. Attend the right events, make the right appearances. But his heart?" She laughed softly. "His heart belongs to me. It always has. And no amount of legal documents or family pressure will change that. Then why isn't he married to you?" For the first time, something flickered in Celeste's expression. Anger, maybe. Or pain disguised as anger. "Because my father gambled away our fortune and died owing debts to half of London. Because Nathaniel's family would never allow him to marry someone without money or title, no matter how much he loved her. Because sometimes love isn't enough to overcome politics and greed and the rotting system that controls all our lives." She drained her brandy and set the glass down hard enough that it cracked. "So yes, you're his wife on paper, but I'm the woman he actually wants, and everyone in London knows it. They're laughing at you, Lady Ashford, every single one of them, and they'll keep laughing until you either accept your place or do us all a favor and disappear." Vivienne felt something cold settle in her chest. Not sadness, not even anger, just clarity. The kind that comes when all illusions finally burn away and you're left staring at truth in its ugliest form. "Thank you," she said quietly. Celeste blinked. "For what?" "For being honest. Most people prefer to lie and pretend. At least you had the decency to say it to my face." She walked past Celeste toward the door, then paused with her hand on the handle. "You're right about one thing," she said without turning around. "Everyone is laughing at me, but they're also laughing at him. At both of you. Because scandal might be entertaining, but it's also exhausting. And eventually, people grow tired of the same joke told over and over. They'll move on to the next scandal, the next gossip, the next dramatic disaster." She opened the door and stepped into the hallway. "But I won't disappear, Lady Whitmore. I refuse to give you that satisfaction." She walked away before Celeste could respond, her heart pounding, her hand shaking, but her head held high. Something had shifted inside her. Some final thread of hope had finally snapped, and in the empty space it left behind, something harder was beginning to grow. But the next morning, Vivienne did something she'd never done before. She left London entirely. She packed a single trunk, told no one where she was going, and hired a private coach to take her north, away from the balls and gossip and pitying stares, away from Nathaniel's indifference and Celeste's cruelty and the suffocating weight of a life she couldn't change. The roads were rough this time of year, still muddy from autumn rains. The journey took 3 days, bumping along rutted paths through countryside that grew progressively wilder and poorer the farther they traveled from the capital. Eventually, the coach arrived in Lancashire, a county Vivienne knew primarily from maps and vague mentions in her father's political discussions. What she found there stopped her heart. Entire villages were collapsing. Not metaphorically, literally crumbling into the earth. Thatched roofs had caved in from winter storms. Families huddled in structures barely standing, their walls patched with mud and straw. Children ran barefoot through icy streets, their faces hollow with hunger. This was the aftermath of war. Napoleon had been defeated months earlier, but victory had come at a cost England's leaders rarely discussed in their comfortable London drawing rooms. Tens of thousands of soldiers had returned home to find no work, no food, no way to support families who'd barely survived their absence. The government had promised support. Parliament had made speeches. But promises didn't fill empty stomachs, and speeches didn't rebuild destroyed homes. Vivienne stepped out of her coach in a village called Harrowsfield and stood in the muddy square, staring at devastation her privileged life had never prepared her to witness. A woman approached her, thin, exhausted, carrying an infant wrapped in rags. "Are you lost, milady?" the woman asked. Vivienne looked at the baby, at the woman's cracked hands, at the desperation carved into every line of her face. "No," she said quietly. "I don't think I am." For the first time in months, Vivienne Hale felt something other than numbness. She felt rage. Not at Nathaniel or Celeste or society's cruelty. Rage at the system that allowed people to starve, while aristocrats spent fortunes on silk gowns and champagne fountains. Rage at her own ignorance. Rage at every wasted moment she'd spent trying to earn affection from a man who would never give it. She turned to her driver. "How much money do we have?" "For the journey home, Your Grace." "No," she said. "For them." And that's when everything changed. That's when the Duchess of Ashford stopped trying to be Nathaniel's wife and started becoming something far more dangerous. Someone who gave a damn about people nobody else cared about. Someone who would use every penny of her personal fortune not to buy jewels or dresses, but to build something real, something that mattered. Someone England would learn to love more than any duchess in history. But Nathaniel wouldn't know any of this for a very long time. He was too busy destroying his reputation, one ballroom scandal at a time. And when he finally learned the truth, when he discovered what his forgotten wife had become, it would be far too late to undo the greatest mistake of his life. Because in that muddy village square in Lancashire, Vivienne Hale stopped being the woman London pitied, and she became the woman England would never forget. The first shelter Vivienne built was nothing more than a barn. She bought it with her own money, not the Ashford fortune, but the personal inheritance her mother had left her years before. It sat on the edge of Harrowsfield, half collapsed, reeking of mold and rotted hay. The previous owner had abandoned it when his livestock died during the brutal winter of 1813. He sold it to her for a fraction of its worth because he thought she was insane. Maybe she was. She stood in the doorway that first morning, staring at broken beams and dirt floors, and felt something close to relief. This was real. This was hers. This wasn't a ballroom where people whispered behind her back or a marriage bed that had never been touched. This was wood and nails and the possibility of doing something that actually mattered. The village carpenter, a man named Thomas with hands like tree roots and a face carved by decades of hard labor, looked at her like she'd lost her mind. "You want me to turn this into what, exactly?" he asked. "A place for families to sleep," she said. "Somewhere warm. Somewhere safe." Thomas scratched his beard. "With respect, Your Grace, this building's barely standing. It'd take weeks of work, maybe months. And even then, it won't be fancy. Won't be nothing like what you're used to." "I don't need fancy," Vivienne said. "I need functional." He studied her for a long moment, then shrugged. "Your money, milady." Within a week, Thomas had gathered a crew of out-of-work soldiers and war widows desperate for any income. They tore down the rotting sections and rebuilt them with salvaged timber. They patched holes in the roof with whatever materials they could scavenge. They dug a well for fresh water and built a massive stone fireplace that could heat the entire structure. Vivienne worked alongside them. She showed up every morning before dawn, dressed in plain wool dresses instead of silk gowns, her hair tied back with simple ribbon. She carried lumber, hammered nails, scraped mud off floors until her hands bled and her back screamed. The workers tried to stop her at first, horrified that a duchess would perform manual labor. But she refused to leave. "If I'm asking you to build this," she told them, "then I'm going to build it too." Word spread quickly through Lancashire. The strange duchess who worked like a commoner. The aristocrat who didn't flinch at dirt or sweat or blisters. Within days, more people arrived. Farmers donated wood. Blacksmiths forged nails for free. Women brought food and stayed to help cook meals for the workers. By the end of the month, the shelter opened its doors. It wasn't beautiful. The floors were uneven, the walls were patched with mismatched boards. But it was warm, it was dry, and it could house 20 families who would have otherwise frozen to death before spring. Vivienne stood outside on opening day, watching mothers carry children through the door, watching exhausted men collapse onto straw beds for the first time in months, and felt something she hadn't felt since her wedding day. Purpose. Not the hollow performance of being a duchess, not the empty ritual of attending balls and smiling for strangers. Real purpose. the kind that lived in your bones and reminded you why survival mattered. She didn't think about Nathaniel once that entire day. Back in London, Nathaniel was busy forgetting she existed. He spent his days managing the Ashford estates with ruthless efficiency, signing documents that moved fortunes between accounts he'd never personally see. His evenings belonged to Celeste. Dinners at exclusive clubs, private boxes at the theater, long carriage rides through Hyde Park where everyone could see them together. He told himself he didn't care what people thought. Told himself that marriage was a political arrangement and nothing more. Told himself that Celeste was the only woman who'd ever understood him, the only person who made him feel alive instead of suffocated by expectations and duty. The truth was messier than that. The truth was that Nathaniel Ashford had been raised by a father who believed affection was weakness and a mother who died when he was 8 years old. He'd learned early that love was a liability, that caring about people gave them power over you, that the only way to survive in a world built on ruthless competition was to care about nothing except victory. So he'd built walls, high ones, made of stone and indifference and the bone-deep conviction that emotional distance was the same thing as strength. Celeste was different. She didn't want forever, didn't demand commitment or loyalty or any of the things wives expected. She wanted excitement, adventure, the thrill of being wanted without the burden of being needed. It was transactional in a way Nathaniel understood. Clean, simple, safe. Vivienne, on the other hand, had looked at him on their wedding day with something that terrified him. Not love, they barely knew each other, but hope. The possibility that they could build something real, that he could be more than just a title and a fortune, that beneath all his carefully constructed armor, there might be something worth caring about. He'd crushed that hope immediately because hope was dangerous. Hope meant vulnerability, and vulnerable men got destroyed. So he'd buried himself in work and Celeste and anything else that let him avoid thinking about the quiet woman he'd married and abandoned in the same breath. He didn't know she'd left London, didn't know she was in Lancashire, didn't know she was building something that would eventually make him look like a footnote in his own legacy. He wouldn't know any of it until it was far too late. 3 months after opening the first shelter, Vivienne expanded. She used more of her inheritance to purchase an abandoned textile mill on the outskirts of another village called Crosswell. The building was massive, 3 stories of broken windows and rusted machinery, but it had good bones, strong walls. A structure that could house hundreds if properly renovated. This time the work went faster. Thomas brought his entire crew. Other craftsmen heard about the project and volunteered their skills. A former military surgeon named Dr. Harrison arrived one morning and offered to set up a medical clinic on the ground floor. A school teacher named Miss Pemberton, no relation to the Lord, asked if she could use one room to teach children how to read. Vivienne said yes to everything. Within 6 months, the mill had transformed into something nobody had seen before. The first floor was a medical clinic where Dr. Harrison treated everything from broken bones to cholera. The second floor housed families, 40 rooms with actual beds and blankets and doors that locked for privacy. The third floor was divided between a school and a communal kitchen that served 3 meals a day to anyone who needed them. Vivienne didn't just fund it, she ran it. She learned how to manage supply chains, negotiate with merchants, organize work schedules. She sat with dying soldiers and held their hands while they cried for mothers who were already dead. She taught children their letters when Miss Pemberton was overwhelmed. She cleaned chamber pots and scrubbed floors and did every single degrading task that needed doing, because if she asked others to do it, she'd damn well better be willing to do it herself. The people of Lancashire noticed. They started calling her England's true lady. Mothers named their daughters Vivienne. When she walked through village squares, strangers would stop and bow, not because she was a duchess, but because she'd earned their respect through action instead of title. And still, Nathaniel had no idea. The first time Parliament mentioned her name, Nathaniel thought it was a mistake. He was sitting in the House of Lords, half listening to a debate about veteran support programs, when Lord Cartwright stood and began speaking. While we waste time arguing about budgets and bureaucracy, there is a woman in Lancashire who has already solved the problem we claim is too complex to address. The Duchess of Ashford has personally funded and operated shelters that house over 300 families. She has established medical clinics that serve thousands. She has created schools that teach children who would otherwise grow up illiterate and hopeless. Nathaniel's head snapped up. Cartwright continued. I propose we visit these facilities. See firsthand what one determined individual has accomplished with a fraction of the resources we control. Perhaps we might learn something about leadership from someone who actually practices it instead of merely performing it. The chamber erupted in murmurs. Some lords nodded in agreement. Others looked skeptical. A few glanced toward Nathaniel with expressions he couldn't quite read. He sat frozen, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. Vivienne? His Vivienne? Impossible. She was in London. She was at the estate. She was somewhere quiet and forgettable, playing the role of dutiful wife while he lived his actual life. Wasn't she? After the session ended, he cornered Cartwright in the corridor. What the hell was that? Nathaniel demanded. Cartwright raised an eyebrow. I'm sorry? That speech. About my wife. What game are you playing? No game, Your Grace. Simply stating facts. Your wife has been in Lancashire for months. Didn't you know? Something cold slithered down Nathaniel's spine. She's in Lancashire, has been since autumn. Remarkable woman. I visited one of her shelters last month. The people there speak of her like she's a saint. Quite impressive, really, considering how little support she's received from her own family. He walked away before Nathaniel could respond. That evening, Nathaniel summoned his estate manager, a meticulous man named Whitfield, who'd served the Ashford family for 30 years. Where is my wife? Nathaniel asked. Whitfield blinked. I beg your pardon, Your Grace? My wife. Where is she? In Lancashire, sir. She left in late September, has been residing there since, managing the charitable facilities she's established. Nathaniel felt like he'd been punched. Charitable facilities. Since September. That was 4 months ago. 4 months, and nobody had told him. 4 months, and he hadn't even noticed she was gone. Why wasn't I informed? He said quietly. You never asked, sir. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Nathaniel dismissed Whitfield and sat alone in his study, staring at nothing. Part of him wanted to ride north immediately and drag Vivienne back to London. Part of him wanted to ignore the whole situation and pretend he'd never heard anything. Part of him felt something uncomfortably close to shame, which he immediately tried to crush, because shame was weakness and weakness got you killed. He did nothing. He told himself it didn't matter, told himself that if Vivienne wanted to waste her time playing charity worker in the north, that was her business. Told himself he had more important things to worry about. But late that night, alone in his bedroom, he couldn't stop thinking about the way Cartwright had looked at him. Not with anger, not with disgust, with pity. As though Nathaniel was the one who'd lost something valuable, as though Nathaniel was the fool. Winter came hard that year. Snow fell in sheets across Lancashire, burying villages under drifts that reached second-story windows. Temperatures dropped so low that water froze solid in minutes. Livestock died in the fields. Roads became impassable. And people who'd barely survived autumn found themselves facing another enemy entirely. Vivienne's shelters became lifelines. Families packed into every available space, huddled around fireplaces, sharing blankets and body heat. Dr. Harrison worked 20-hour days treating frostbite and pneumonia. Miss Pemberton turned her classroom into a dormitory for children whose parents had died. The kitchens ran non-stop, serving thin soup made from whatever ingredients they could scavenge. Vivienne pushed herself harder than anyone. She slept 3 hours a night, ate 1 meal a day, spent every waking moment moving between shelters, checking supplies, comforting the dying, organizing burial details for those who didn't make it. Her hands were permanently cracked and bleeding. Her face was gaunt. Her hair had started going gray at the temples, even though she was only 23 years old. Margaret, her lady's maid who'd followed her north despite Vivienne's protests, finally confronted her one night. You're going to kill yourself, Margaret said bluntly. Then I'll die doing something that matters, Vivienne replied without looking up from the supply ledgers she was reviewing. What about your health? Your future? What future? Vivienne's voice was flat. I'm married to a man who forgot I existed. I have no children, no real home. The only thing I have is this. So yes, Margaret, I'll work until I collapse if that's what it takes to keep these people alive. Because unlike everyone else in my life, they actually need me. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then, he doesn't deserve you. No, Vivienne said softly. He doesn't. But the truth was more complicated than that. The truth was that somewhere between the first shelter and the 100th child she'd fed, Vivienne had stopped caring what Nathaniel deserved. She'd stopped thinking about him entirely. The woman who'd cried herself to sleep after the Chamberlain ball felt like a stranger now. Someone weak. Someone who'd wasted tears on a man who'd never been worth them. This version of Vivienne was harder, sharper. Built from necessity and exhaustion and the brutal clarity that comes from watching people die because the world doesn't care enough to save them. She'd learned something in Lancashire that London had never taught her, that real power had nothing to do with titles or bloodlines. Real power was feeding hungry children, warming cold bodies, giving desperate people a reason to survive one more day. And nobody, not Nathaniel, not society, not even God himself, could take that away from her. Atsik. By spring, her reputation had spread beyond Lancashire. Newspapers in Manchester ran stories about the Duchess, who refused to quit. Political reformers cited her work as proof that England's aristocracy could actually help instead of just exploit. Religious leaders praised her Christian charity, which irritated Vivienne because her motivation had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with rage at systemic injustice. The tipping point came in April when a journalist from The Times visited her largest shelter in Crosswell. His name was Edmund Price, a cynical man in his 50s who'd covered wars and scandals and every ugly thing humans did to each other. He arrived expecting to write a puff piece about a bored aristocrat playing at charity. He left 3 days later with an article that would change everything. It ran on the front page. The headline read, "The Duchess, England Forgot, and the People She Refused to Abandon." Price's article was brutal in its honesty. He described the conditions Vivienne was fighting against, the government failures that had created the crisis, the aristocrats who'd promised help and delivered nothing. And then he described Vivienne herself, exhausted, unpolished, working alongside commoners without pretense or performance. One paragraph in particular spread like wildfire. "I have met kings and queens, generals and diplomats, men who command armies and women who rule empires of wealth. But I have never met anyone who embodies true nobility the way the Duchess of Ashford does. She does not rule from a throne. She does not command from a distance. She kneels in the mud beside dying soldiers and holds their hands while they take their last breaths. And when she stands, she does not wash away the dirt. She wears it like armor." The article destroyed what was left of Nathaniel's reputation. Within days, London society turned on him completely. Women who'd once envied Celeste now whispered that she was a vulgar distraction. Men who'd respected Nathaniel's political acumen now questioned his judgment. Even his closest allies began distancing themselves. Lord Pembroke cornered him at his club one evening. "You've become a liability," Pembroke said without preamble. "Half of Parliament thinks you're a fool for ignoring your wife. The other half thinks you're cruel. Either way, you're finished if you don't fix this." "There's nothing to fix," Nathaniel said coldly. "Vivienne is free to do whatever she wants." "Is she?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you abandoned her." And she responded by becoming the most admired woman in England while you parade your mistress through ballrooms like a prize cow. You're not just embarrassing yourself anymore. You're embarrassing everyone associated with you. Nathaniel slammed his glass down hard enough to crack it. "I don't need your advice." "No," Pembroke said quietly. "You need a miracle. Because your wife just became untouchable, and you're still acting like the rules that protected you before still apply. They don't. Not anymore." He left Nathaniel sitting alone at the table, bleeding from a cut on his palm where the glass had shattered, staring at nothing. Hots. The Royal Winter Ball of 1815 approached like a storm. It was the social event of the season, an annual gathering where England's most powerful families displayed their wealth and influence. Attendance was mandatory for anyone who mattered. Absence was noticed, judged. Vivienne had been invited, of course, but for the first time in her marriage, she considered refusing. She was sitting in her small room above the Crosswell shelter when Margaret brought her the formal invitation. Vivienne stared at the embossed paper, at the elaborate calligraphy, at the seal of the royal household. It felt like a relic from another life. "You should go," Margaret said. "Why?" "Because if you don't, they'll say you're hiding. They'll say you're ashamed." "I don't care what they say. Maybe not. But the people here care. They're proud of you. They want to see you walk into that ballroom and remind every aristocrat in England that you're not the woman they pitied anymore." Vivienne looked up. "And what am I now?" Margaret smiled slightly. Someone they should be afraid of. 3 days later, Vivienne returned to London for the first time in 8 months. She wore a gown she'd commissioned specifically for the occasion, not from an expensive French designer, but from a seamstress in Crosswell who'd lost her husband to war. It was deep blue, simple in cut but elegant in execution. No jewels except her mother's pearl earrings. No elaborate hairstyle, just clean lines and quiet dignity. She arrived at the ball alone. The moment she stepped into the ballroom, conversations stopped. Every head turned, every eye tracked her movement across the marble floor. She could feel their judgment, their curiosity, their shock at seeing her return after being so thoroughly humiliated. But she didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. She walked to the center of the room, accepted a glass of champagne from a passing servant, and stood there like she owned the space. Across the ballroom, Nathaniel froze. He'd been standing near the orchestra with Celeste on his arm, laughing at something she'd said, when he saw his wife for the first time in months. She looked different, thinner, older, but also stronger somehow. Like she'd been forged in fire and come out the other side made of something harder than before. Celeste followed his gaze and went very still. For a long moment, the three of them existed in a strange tableau. The husband, the mistress, the forgotten wife who'd stopped being forgotten. Then Vivienne turned away and began speaking with Lord Cartwright, who'd approached her with genuine warmth. Nathaniel felt something twist in his chest, something uncomfortable, something he refused to name. He drained his champagne and tried to ignore the growing sense that he'd made a terrible mistake. Bulk. The confrontation happened 2 hours later. Nathaniel had spent the evening watching Vivienne move through the ballroom, watched politicians seek her out, watched women who'd once mocked her now trying to befriend her. She spoke with confidence, laughed easily, seemed completely unbothered by his presence. It drove him insane. Finally, he approached her when she was alone near the terrace doors. "We need to talk," he said. She turned slowly, her expression perfectly neutral. "Do we?" "Yes." "About your little project in Lancashire." Her eyes went cold. "My little project. Is that what you're calling it? What else would I call it? You disappeared without telling anyone, spent months playing charity worker, and now you're parading around London acting like you've accomplished something meaningful. I have accomplished something meaningful. Have you? Or have you just been seeking attention because you couldn't get it from me?" The words were designed to hurt, to put her back in her place, to remind her that he still had power over her. But Vivienne didn't flinch. She simply looked at him like he was a stranger, someone beneath her notice. "You know what the saddest part is?" she said quietly. "I used to think your cruelty came from pain, that maybe if I tried hard enough, I could reach whatever was broken inside you. But I was wrong. You're not broken, Nathaniel. You're just empty. And emptiness can't be fixed because there's nothing there to save." She turned to leave. He grabbed her wrist. "I'm not done talking to you." "Yes," she said, pulling free. "You are." She walked out onto the terrace, leaving him standing there, his heart pounding, his mind spinning. He followed her outside. The terrace was empty, lit only by moonlight and distant ballroom chandeliers. Vivienne stood at the stone railing, staring out at London's glittering skyline. "I could ruin you," Nathaniel said. "I could cut off your funding, shut down every shelter you've built." "You could try," Vivienne said, without turning around. "But I don't use your money, I use mine. And even if you somehow managed to take that away, the people of Lancashire would rebuild everything themselves. Because they don't follow me because of my title. They follow me because I've earned their loyalty. Something you've never understood how to do. This is my legacy you're playing with." "No, it's mine. You abandoned it. I claimed it." She finally turned to face him. "You wanted a wife who would stay silent while you humiliated her, who would play the role of decorative Duchess and never demand anything real from you. And I gave you that for months. But then I realized something. Your approval, your affection, your attention, none of it mattered, because you don't actually have anything worth wanting." The words hit harder than any physical blow could have. Nathaniel stood there, breathing hard, feeling something crack inside his carefully constructed armor. "I'm going to do something tonight," Vivienne continued. "Something I should have done months ago." "What?" "I'm going to announce our separation, publicly, in front of everyone who matters. And then I'm going to leave London forever." "You wouldn't dare! Watch me." She walked past him back into the ballroom. Nathaniel stood frozen on the terrace, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to stop her. Part of him wanted to let her go. Part of him felt something he'd never allowed himself to feel before: fear. Not fear of scandal or political consequences or losing his reputation. Fear that he'd just destroyed the only person who'd ever been brave enough to try loving him. But it was too late to take back the damage. By the time he returned to the ballroom, Vivienne was already standing in the center of the room, and someone had called for silence. She didn't cry. Vivienne stood beneath the chandelier lights, surrounded by England's elite, and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the massive ballroom. "I have an announcement to make," she said. "My husband, the Duke of Ashford, and I are separating, effective immediately." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone dropped a glass. The orchestra stopped mid-song. "This is not a decision made from anger or spite," Vivienne continued. "It is simply an acknowledgement of truth. We were married for political reasons. We never loved each other, and I see no reason to continue pretending otherwise." She reached up and unclasped the diamond bracelet Nathaniel had given her on their wedding day, the Ashford family heirloom, worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. She walked across the ballroom to where he stood and placed it in his hand. Their eyes met. For just a moment, Nathaniel saw something in her expression that made his chest tighten. Not hatred, not sadness, just finality. The look of someone closing a door that would never open again. "Thank you for the title," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "But I don't need it anymore." She walked out of the royal winter ball without looking back. The ballroom erupted in chaos behind her, and Nathaniel stood there, holding the bracelet, feeling the weight of everything he'd lost crushing down on him like a collapsing building. Because somewhere between abandoning his wife and parading his mistress through London, he'd made an enemy of the one person who could have been his salvation. And now she was gone, and there was no going back. The scandal should have destroyed Vivienne. That's what everyone expected. That's what the rules demanded. A duchess who publicly humiliated her husband, who rejected the Ashford name in front of parliament members and foreign ambassadors, who walked out of the royal winter ball like she was discarding trash. That woman should have been ruined, exiled from society, forgotten within weeks. Instead, something else happened entirely. By morning, every newspaper in London was printing her name. Not with mockery, not with scandal, with admiration. The woman who refused to be broken, the Duchess who chose dignity over decoration. Headlines screamed variations of the same story, the separation that shocked England. One editorial in the Morning Chronicle called her the bravest woman in the kingdom. Another described Nathaniel as a fool who'd traded gold for copper and didn't realize his mistake until it was too late. Public opinion turned so fast it gave Nathaniel whiplash. He woke the morning after the ball to find his butler standing in his bedroom doorway, holding a silver tray stacked with newspapers. The man's face was carefully blank, but Nathaniel could read the judgment in his posture. Everyone in the household knew what had happened. Everyone had chosen sides, and Nathaniel was losing. He sat up, grabbed the first paper, and read 3 sentences before throwing it across the room. "Get out," he said. The butler left without a word. Nathaniel sat alone in his bedroom, surrounded by silk sheets and imported furniture and all the expensive emptiness his title had bought him, and felt something he'd never experienced before. Not shame. He'd buried that instinct years ago. Not regret. That required admitting mistakes, which he refused to do. What he felt was closer to vertigo. The sensation of standing on solid ground and suddenly discovering it was quicksand all along. His entire life had been built on a simple principle. Power came from control. Control your emotions. Control your reputation. Control everyone around you before they could control you. It had worked for 29 years. It had made him one of the most influential men in England. And then Vivienne had walked away, and the whole structure collapsed like a house made of cards. He didn't understand it, couldn't process it. She was nobody, a woman, a wife, someone who should have been grateful for the privilege of carrying his name. How dare she reject him? How dare she make him look weak in front of everyone who mattered? But the newspapers didn't see weakness in Vivienne. They saw strength. And every article that praised her was a knife in Nathaniel's back, stabbed there by his own arrogance. He got dressed and went downstairs to find Celeste waiting in his study. She looked different this morning, less polished. Her hair wasn't perfectly arranged. Her dress was wrinkled. And her eyes, those eyes that had once made him forget everything else, looked calculating in a way that made his skin crawl. "We need to talk," she said. "Not now." "Yes, now. Because in case you haven't noticed, we're both finished if we don't fix this immediately." "There's nothing to fix," Nathaniel said, pouring himself brandy even though it was barely 9 in the morning. Vivienne made her choice. Let her rot in Lancashire with the peasants. "You really don't understand, do you?" Celeste laughed, but it was a brittle sound. "She didn't lose last night. You did. She walked out of that ballroom a martyr. And you stayed behind looking like the villain. Do you know what people are saying? They're saying you drove away the best thing that ever happened to you. They're saying you're cruel and stupid and unworthy of the Ashford name. I don't care what they say. Then you're more of a fool than I thought." Something in her tone made him look up sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" She stood and walked to the window, staring out at the London streets. "I came back from Paris for you," she said quietly. "I gave up everything for you. My reputation, my chances of marrying someone else. I gambled everything on the belief that we could build something real together. We did build something." "No, Nathaniel. We built a scandal. And scandals only work if they're entertaining. The moment they become pathetic, people lose interest. And right now, we're pathetic." The word hit him like a slap. "If you're not happy, you know where the door is," he said coldly. Celeste turned to face him, and for the first time since she'd returned from Paris, he saw something other than desire in her expression. He saw contempt. "Careful," she said. "You're running out of people willing to stand beside you." She left before he could respond. Nathaniel stood alone in his study, gripping the brandy glass so hard it cracked in his hand. Blood dripped onto the expensive carpet. He didn't move, didn't clean it, just stood there, feeling the first real cracks forming in the armor he'd spent his entire life building. Vivienne returned to Lancashire the next day. She traveled alone, carrying nothing but a single trunk and the clothes on her back. The diamond bracelet was gone. The Ashford name was gone. Everything that had defined her identity in London had been stripped away, and she felt lighter than she had in years. The coach ride took 3 days. She spent most of it staring out the window, watching the landscape shift from London's coal-smoke skies to the open fields of the north. With every mile, she felt the weight of performance falling away. No more pretending, no more playing the role of dutiful wife to a man who'd never wanted her. No more smiling through humiliation while society placed bets on how long she'd last. She was done with all of it. When the coach finally arrived in Crosswell, she stepped out to find a crowd waiting. Word had spread about the separation, about her public rejection of Nathaniel, about her decision to choose this life, this real, messy, difficult life, over the empty luxury of being a duchess. The villagers stood in the square, silent at first, just watching her. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Then 50 people were applauding, and mothers were crying, and soldiers were saluting, and children were shouting her name. Vivienne stood there, overwhelmed, feeling tears she'd refused to shed in London finally breaking free. "Welcome home, Doctor," Harrison said, stepping forward with a smile. "Home." The word settled into her chest like an anchor. This was home now, not a palace or an estate or any place that bore the Ashford name. This muddy village with its broken people and impossible problems and the daily struggle just to survive. This was where she belonged. She threw herself back into the work with even more intensity than before. Opened 2 more shelters. Established a textile cooperative so war widows could earn income making clothes. Negotiated with merchants to secure food supplies at lower prices. Wrote letters to Parliament members demanding veteran support programs. And when they ignored her, she published those letters in newspapers so the public could see exactly how little their government cared. Slowly, month by month, she built something no duchess had ever built before. Not a legacy based on bloodline or title, a legacy based on action. On caring when it was inconvenient, on refusing to look away from suffering just because it was easier. And England noticed. By summer, she was receiving letters from all over the country. Reformers asking for her guidance. Politicians requesting meetings. Wealthy families offering donations to her shelters. She'd become a symbol of something larger than herself. Proof that the aristocracy could be more than parasites feeding on the labor of everyone beneath them. She didn't want to be a symbol. She just wanted to keep people alive. But symbols have power, and power attracts predators. Listen, The first hint of trouble came in August. Vivienne was reviewing supply ledgers in her office when Thomas knocked on the door. His face was grim. "We have a problem," he said. "What kind of problem?" "Money. We're missing nearly £3,000 from the operating fund." Vivienne went very still. "That's impossible. I reviewed the accounts last week. Everything balanced. It balanced then. It doesn't balance now." She stood and followed him to the storage room where they kept financial records. Spread across the table were ledgers showing deposits, withdrawals, expenses. Thomas pointed to a series of entries dated over the past 6 weeks. "Someone's been making unauthorized withdrawals," he said. "Small amounts at first, £50 here, 100 there. Nothing large enough to notice immediately. But they add up." Vivienne scanned the pages, her mind racing. Who has access to these accounts? Just you, me, Dr. Harrison, and Miss Pemberton. And Margaret, since she helps with record keeping. It couldn't be Thomas. He'd been with her from the beginning, had turned down higher-paying work to stay. Dr. Harrison barely touched the finances. He was too busy treating patients. Miss Pemberton was too honest to the point of being naive. That left Margaret. No, Vivienne thought immediately. Margaret had been with her for years, had followed her to Lancashire when every other servant abandoned her, had worked brutal hours without complaint, sleeping on floors and eating watered-down soup right alongside everyone else. But the numbers didn't lie. "I'll handle this," Vivienne said quietly. "How?" "I'll talk to everyone individually. Someone made a mistake. That's all this is. A mistake." But deep down, in a place she didn't want to examine too closely, she knew it wasn't a mistake. She found Margaret in the medical clinic, helping Dr. Harrison change bandages on a soldier who'd lost both legs in the war. "Can I speak with you?" Vivienne asked. Margaret looked up, and for just a fraction of a second, something flickered across her face. Fear, maybe. Or guilt. Then it was gone, replaced by her usual calm efficiency. "Of course, Your Grace." They walked outside to the small garden behind the clinic. It was a beautiful day. Warm sun, clear sky, the kind of weather that made suffering feel almost bearable. "We're missing money," Vivienne said without preamble. £3,000. Margaret's face didn't change. "That's terrible. Do you know who took it?" "Not yet. But I will. I'm sure you will. You're very thorough." Something in her tone made Vivienne's stomach tighten. "Margaret, if you know something—" "I don't know anything," Margaret interrupted. "But I'll help however I can. We all will." She walked away before Vivienne could press further. That night, Vivienne couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of numbers that didn't add up, and loyalties that suddenly felt uncertain. She wanted to believe Margaret was innocent, wanted to believe that someone else, some outsider, some stranger, had found a way to steal from them. But the evidence pointed in only one direction. And if Margaret had betrayed her, then everything Vivienne thought she knew about trust and loyalty and human decency was wrong. The truth revealed itself 3 days later in the worst possible way. Vivienne was meeting with a group of local farmers about winter wheat supplies when Thomas burst into the room, his face pale. "You need to come now," he said. "What happened? Just come." She followed him outside to find a crowd gathered in the village square. At the center stood 2 constables and a man Vivienne recognized as a London solicitor named Graves, someone who'd handled legal work for wealthy families. And beside them, in handcuffs, was Dr. Harrison. "What is this?" Vivienne demanded. Graves turned to her with an expression that was almost apologetic. "Lady Ashford, I'm afraid, Doctor. Harrison has been arrested for embezzlement and fraud." "That's insane. He's done nothing wrong. On the contrary, we have evidence that he's been systematically stealing from your charitable fund for months. Nearly £8,000 in total. 8,000. The number hit Vivienne like a physical blow. That was more than double what Thomas had discovered. "You're lying," she said. "I wish I were." Graves pulled out a stack of documents. Bank records. Forged signatures. Deposits into private accounts under false names. "It's all here." Dr. Harrison stood silent, his head down, his hands shaking. "Tell them," Vivienne said. "Tell them this is a mistake." He didn't speak. She stepped closer. "Dr. Harrison, look at me." Finally, he raised his head. His eyes were red. His face was hollow. And in that moment, Vivienne saw the truth written across every line of his expression. He'd done it, all of it. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. My daughter, she's dying. Consumption. The only treatment that might save her costs a fortune. I tried everything else. Begged every hospital, but nobody cares about a poor physician's child. He couldn't finish. The crowd murmured, some angry, some sympathetic, all shocked. Vivienne felt like she was drowning. Dr. Harrison had been one of her first allies, one of the people she'd trusted most. He'd worked 18-hour days treating patients who couldn't pay. He'd saved countless lives, and now she was learning that the entire time he'd been stealing from the very people he claimed to serve. The constables led him away. Vivienne stood in the square, surrounded by people who looked to her for answers, and realized she had none to give. But the nightmare wasn't over. That evening, as she sat in her office trying to salvage what was left of their finances, Margaret knocked on the door. Come in, Vivienne said without looking up. Margaret stepped inside and closed the door behind her. For a moment, she just stood there, silent. Finally, Vivienne looked up. What is it? Margaret's face was strange. Not guilty, not afraid, almost satisfied. I'm leaving, she said. What? I'm going back to London. Tonight. I thought you should know. Vivienne stood slowly. Why? Because this is over. All of it. Your little charity project, your reputation as England's savior. It's done. Something cold slithered down Vivienne's spine. What did you do? Margaret smiled. It wasn't a kind expression. I did what I had to do to survive, just like you taught me. She pulled an envelope from her dress and tossed it onto the desk. Inside were copies of financial documents, falsified records, forged signatures, evidence of embezzlement that pointed not to Dr. Harrison, but to Vivienne herself. You see, Margaret continued, Dr. Harrison wasn't working alone. He had help. My help. We've been skimming money for months. But the beautiful part? All the evidence points to you. Your signature, your accounts, your authorization. You forged everything. Prove it. Because by the time anyone investigates, I'll be long gone. And you'll be the one standing trial for stealing from the very people you claim to save. Vivienne felt the world tilting. Why? I gave you everything. I trusted you. And I was tired of eating scraps while you played saint, Margaret said coldly. You think I wanted to spend my life in this muddy village, sleeping on floors and pretending to care about peasants? I didn't follow you north out of loyalty. I followed you because I knew eventually there'd be money, real money. And I was right. Where's the money now? Safe. Hidden. In accounts you'll never find. And in a few months, when this scandal dies down, I'll access it quietly and live the life I actually deserve. She walked toward the door, then paused. You should have stayed in London, Vivienne. Should have played the role of forgotten Duchess and accepted your place. But you had to be special, had to prove something, and now look where it got you. She left. Vivienne stood alone in the office, holding forged documents that would destroy everything she'd built, and felt something inside her break. Not her will, not her determination, but her last remaining illusion about human nature. She'd believed that if you helped people, they'd help you back. That loyalty could be earned through kindness. That doing good work was its own protection against betrayal. She'd been wrong. The world didn't reward virtue. It exploited it. And the moment you revealed weakness, the moment you trusted the wrong person, you became prey. The scandal broke 2 days later. Someone, Margaret probably, had leaked the falsified documents to London newspapers. Within hours, every major publication was running stories about the Duchess who stole from the poor. Editorials that had praised her months earlier now condemned her as a fraud. Politicians who'd supported her work publicly distanced themselves. Donations stopped overnight. The shelters didn't close immediately, but they might as well have. Families who'd trusted Vivienne now looked at her with suspicion. Volunteers stopped showing up. Merchants refused to extend credit. The entire operation that had taken months to build began collapsing in days. Vivienne tried to fight back. She wrote letters explaining the truth, published statements denying the charges, begged people to investigate properly instead of believing forged documents. Nobody listened. Because the story of a fallen saint was more interesting than the truth. Because people who'd been inspired by her success secretly enjoyed watching her fail. Because England loved building heroes almost as much as it loved destroying them. Within a week, she was alone. Thomas left first, apologizing but explaining he had a family to feed and couldn't be associated with scandal. Miss Pemberton followed, sobbing but terrified of losing her teaching license. One by one, everyone who'd worked beside her disappeared. By the end of August, Vivienne was sitting in an empty shelter with no money, no allies, and no way forward. She'd lost everything, and the cruelest part? She'd lost it not because she'd failed, but because she'd succeeded. Because she'd dared to matter. Because she'd threatened the natural order where aristocrats played games and common people suffered in silence. She sat on the floor of the empty building she'd once filled with hope, and for the first time since arriving in Lancashire, she considered giving up entirely. Maybe Margaret was right. Maybe this had all been pointless. Maybe the world was exactly as brutal as it appeared, and trying to change it was just another form of delusion. She thought about Nathaniel, wondered if he was laughing somewhere in London, reading about her downfall, feeling vindicated. Then she thought about the families she'd saved, the children she'd fed, the soldiers she'd comforted while they died. None of that had been fake. None of that had been fraud. The work had been real. Even if everything else was collapsing, that truth remained. Vivienne stood slowly, her body aching, her spirit battered but not quite broken. She'd been destroyed before, after her mother died, after her father ignored her, after Nathaniel abandoned her. She'd survived all of it by refusing to let cruelty define her. She could survive this too, but she couldn't do it alone. And there was only one person left in England with the power and resources to help her prove the truth. The same person who'd humiliated her, who'd driven her away, who probably wanted nothing more than to watch her burn, her husband. Vivienne arrived in London 3 days later, looking like a ghost. She hadn't slept, hadn't eaten properly. Her dress was wrinkled, her hair was loose, dark circles shadowed her eyes. She looked nothing like the polished Duchess who'd walked out of the royal winter ball months earlier. She looked like someone who'd been through hell and barely survived. The Ashford estate loomed before her, massive and cold in the late summer heat. She stood at the gates for a long time, staring at the building that had once been her prison, knowing that walking through those doors meant surrendering the last shred of pride she had left. But pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. She walked up the steps and knocked. The butler opened his door, his eyes widening in shock. "I need to see the Duke," Vivienne said. "He's not now." Something in her voice made him step aside. She walked through hallways she'd once wandered alone, past rooms where she'd eaten silent dinners and slept in a bed that had never been shared. The estate felt different now. Emptier somehow. Like the weight of scandal had drained even the architecture of whatever grandeur it once held. She found Nathaniel in his study, sitting at his desk, reviewing papers with the same mechanical precision he brought to everything. He looked up when she entered, and for just a moment something flickered across his face. Surprise. Maybe concern. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold indifference she remembered. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "I need your help." The words tasted like poison. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You have some nerve coming back here after everything you said. After how you humiliated me. I was set up," she said. "The embezzlement, the fraud. None of it was me. It was my maid and Dr. Harrison. They forged documents and stole money and made it look like I was responsible. And you want me to believe that. I want you to investigate. You have resources I don't. Connections. Money. If anyone can prove the truth, it's you." Nathaniel was silent for a long time. Then he smiled. It was not a kind expression. "Why should I help you?" he asked softly. "You destroyed my reputation, turned all of London against me, made me look like a fool in front of everyone who matters. And now you come crawling back, asking for favors?" "Because it's the right thing to do." "The right thing," he repeated. "Since when do you think I care about what's right?" Vivienne felt something inside her shatter. Not hope. She'd already lost that. But the last fragile belief that somewhere beneath his cruelty, there might be something human worth reaching. "Then I was wrong about you," she said quietly. "I thought maybe, if you saw me broken enough, you'd remember what mercy looks like. But you don't know how, do you? You're exactly what I said you were. Empty." She turned to leave. "Wait," Nathaniel said. She stopped. He stood and walked around the desk until he was standing directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, close enough to smell brandy on his breath. "I'll help you," he said. "But not because I believe you, and not because I care about your reputation. I'll help you because watching you beg was the most satisfying thing I've experienced in months." The words were designed to destroy her, but Vivienne had already been destroyed. What was left was something harder, something that had been forged in betrayal and loss, and the brutal understanding that survival required accepting help even from people who hated you. "Fine," she said, "as long as you help." Nathaniel smiled again. That same cruel expression. And that's when Vivienne realized the truth. She'd come here thinking Nathaniel was her last option, her final desperate gamble. But he wasn't going to save her. He was going to use her suffering as entertainment, drag out the investigation just long enough to watch her squirm. And when it was over, whether she was vindicated or destroyed, he'd walk away without losing a single night of sleep. She'd made a terrible mistake coming here, but it was too late to take it back, because now she was trapped, dependent on a man who despised her, forced to play the role of grateful supplicant while he held her future in hands that had never shown anyone mercy. And the worst part? There was absolutely nothing she could do about it. Nathaniel kept his promise in the cruelest way possible. He hired investigators, audited financial records, interviewed witnesses, did everything necessary to uncover the truth about the embezzlement scandal. But he did it slowly, deliberately, drawing out each step like a man savoring expensive wine, watching Vivienne squirm with every passing day that brought no answers. She had no choice but to wait. She stayed in a small rented room above a tailor shop in one of London's less fashionable districts. Not because she wanted to hide, but because the Ashford estate felt like swallowing poison, and she refused to beg for shelter under Nathaniel's roof. The room was cramped and cold, with thin walls that let in every sound from the street below. Drunks shouting at midnight, carriage wheels grinding against cobblestones at dawn, the constant reminder that she'd fallen from Duchess to nobody in less than a year. Every morning, she walked to Nathaniel's estate to ask for updates. Every morning, he told her the same thing: be patient. It was a special kind of torture, not the sharp pain of betrayal or the hollow ache of abandonment. This was slow suffocation, the daily humiliation of needing help from someone who enjoyed watching you need it, of standing in his study while he reviewed documents with infuriating precision, occasionally glancing up to make sure she was still there, still desperate, still trapped. 2 weeks passed this way. Then 3. Vivienne felt herself fragmenting, not breaking. She'd survived too much to break completely, but splintering into pieces she wasn't sure how to hold together. At night, she'd lie awake in her rented room and wonder if Margaret had been right. Maybe fighting was pointless. Maybe the world rewarded cruelty and punished compassion, and everything she'd tried to build in Lancashire had been nothing more than a beautiful delusion. But every time that thought took hold, she'd remember the faces of the families she'd sheltered, the children she'd fed, the soldiers she'd comforted. Those people had been real. Their gratitude had been real, and no amount of scandal or betrayal could erase the fact that for a few brief months, she'd actually mattered. That truth was the only thing keeping her alive. The breakthrough came in late September, on a morning when Vivienne had almost stopped hoping. She arrived at the estate expecting another day of empty reassurances. Instead, she found Nathaniel waiting for her in the entrance hall, holding a folder thick with documents. His expression was unreadable. "We need to talk," he said. She followed him to the study, her heart pounding. He closed the door and gestured for her to sit. She remained standing. "Did you find something?" she asked. Nathaniel opened the folder and spread papers across his desk. Bank records, forged signatures, testimony from witnesses. She pointed to one document in particular, a letter written in Margaret's handwriting, addressed to someone named Vincent Marsh. "Your maid wasn't working alone," Nathaniel said. "She had a partner, a London financier named Marsh who specializes in money laundering and fraud. They met in Paris 2 years ago, stayed in contact, and when Margaret saw an opportunity to profit from your charity work, she brought him in to help." Vivienne felt something cold settle in her chest. "Where's the money now?" "Gone. Transferred through shell accounts across 3 countries. By the time my investigators traced the trail, Marsh had already moved it again. He's very good at what he does. So we can't recover it." "No. But we can prove you didn't take it." He pulled out another document, a report from a handwriting expert comparing the forged signatures to Vivienne's actual writing. The differences were subtle but clear to anyone who looked closely enough. This proves the signatures were faked, Nathaniel continued, combined with witness testimony placing Margaret and Marsh together on multiple occasions, and bank records showing deposits into accounts you never authorized. We have enough evidence to clear your name. Vivienne stared at the papers, barely breathing. After weeks of drowning, someone had finally thrown her a rope. Why? She asked quietly. Nathaniel looked up. Why what? Why help me? You could have sat on this evidence, let me burn, enjoyed watching me destroyed. He was silent for a long moment, his expression impossible to read. Because watching you suffer stopped being satisfying 3 days into the investigation, he said finally. It just became sad. The admission hung in the air between them. Vivienne sat down slowly, her legs suddenly weak. What happens now? Now we make this public. I'll present the evidence to Parliament, have them issue a formal statement clearing you of all charges. The newspapers will print corrections. Your reputation will be restored. And Margaret? Already fled the country, probably in France by now, living off stolen money and laughing at both of us. What about Dr. Harrison? Nathaniel's jaw tightened. That's more complicated. He did steal from you, but his motivations were understandable. His daughter really was dying. I've arranged for her treatment to be paid for, and I'm petitioning to have his sentence reduced. He'll serve time, but not as much as he deserves. You did that. It wasn't a question. Nathaniel shrugged. I did a lot of things while investigating your situation. Some of them surprised even me. Vivienne studied him carefully. He looked different than she remembered. Thinner, more tired. Like the past few weeks had cost him something too. Thank you, she said. The words felt inadequate, but they were all she had. Nathaniel stood and walked to the window, staring out at the gardens. Don't thank me yet, because there's something else you need to know. What? Celeste was involved. The words hit Vivienne like a punch to the stomach. What? Not directly, but she knew about Margaret's plan. Margaret told her weeks before executing it, and Celeste encouraged her to go through with it. She thought destroying you would eliminate the last obstacle between us. That once you were gone, I'd finally commit to her completely. Vivienne felt rage building in her chest. Where is she? Here. I confronted her 2 days ago. She's been living in the estate since you left. Living here. In Vivienne's home. Sleeping in rooms that should have been hers. Playing the role of Duchess while the actual Duchess rotted in scandal. I want to see her, Vivienne said quietly. That's not a good idea. I don't care. I want to see her. Now. They found Celeste in the drawing room, sitting by the fireplace with a book she wasn't reading. She looked up when they entered, and for just a moment, fear flickered across her perfect features. Then she composed herself, standing with the practiced grace of someone who'd spent her entire life performing elegance. Vivienne, she said, I heard you were back. You knew, Vivienne said. You knew Margaret was going to destroy me, and you did nothing. Celeste smiled slightly. I did more than nothing. I encouraged her. Why? Because you were in the way. You were always in the way. From the moment Nathaniel married you, I've had to compete with a ghost. The dutiful wife he never wanted but couldn't quite discard. I thought if you were completely ruined, he'd finally let you go. And instead, he investigated until he proved my innocence. Celeste's smile faltered. Yes, that was unexpected. She glanced at Nathaniel, something desperate creeping into her expression. But it doesn't change anything, does it? She's still the wife you never loved, the marriage you never wanted. Clearing her name doesn't make her matter to you. Nathaniel said nothing. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Celeste laughed, a brittle, broken sound. You're really not going to say anything after everything I've done for you? After I came back from Paris and gave up everything? You gave up nothing, Nathaniel said quietly. You came back because you were broke and desperate and thought I'd be grateful enough to fund your lifestyle. And I was stupid enough to believe you actually cared about me instead of my money. I do care. No, you don't. You care about what I can give you. Status, wealth, access to power. But the moment I stop being useful, you'll move on to the next fool willing to be manipulated. Celeste's face went pale. You don't mean that. Yes, he said. I do. He pulled a document from his jacket and handed it to her. This is a settlement agreement. I'm giving you £10,000 to leave England and never return. Sign it, and you'll have enough money to live comfortably for years. Refuse, and I'll make sure every person in London knows exactly what you did to Vivienne." Celeste stared at the document, her hands shaking. "You're choosing her over me. I'm choosing honesty over manipulation. There's a difference." She looked at Vivienne, and for the first time there was no calculation in her expression, just raw hatred. "You won," she said. "I hope you're happy." "I'm not happy," Vivienne replied. "I'm just tired of watching you destroy everything you touch." Celeste signed the document with violent strokes, threw it at Nathaniel, and walked out of the room without another word. They listened to her footsteps echo through the hallway, heard the front door slam, heard a carriage pulling away, then silence. Vivienne stood in the drawing room that had once felt like a prison and felt absolutely nothing. Not satisfaction, not victory, just the hollow awareness that cruelty always lost in the end, even when winning felt like nothing at all. The public vindication happened faster than expected. Within a week, Parliament issued a statement clearing Vivienne of all charges. Newspapers printed retractions. Politicians who'd condemned her suddenly remembered they'd always supported her work. Donations started flowing back to the Lancashire shelters, and letters arrived daily from people apologizing for believing the lies. Vivienne should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt exhausted. Because vindication didn't erase the damage. The shelters had closed during the scandal. Families had been displaced. Children had gone hungry. And no amount of apologies could undo the suffering that had happened while everyone rushed to judgment. She returned to Lancashire in early October, determined to rebuild what had been destroyed. The villages welcomed her back with quiet gratitude. People who doubted her now looked ashamed. Workers who'd abandoned her returned, asking for forgiveness. Slowly, painfully, the shelters began reopening, but something had changed. Vivienne worked with the same intensity as before, but the joy was gone. She went through the motions, organizing supplies, treating patients, teaching children, but it felt mechanical now, like she was performing a role instead of living a purpose. Late one night, Thomas found her sitting alone in an empty shelter, staring at nothing. "You should rest," he said gently. "I can't." "Why not?" "Because the moment I stop moving, I'll have to think about everything that happened, and I'm not ready for that yet." Thomas sat down beside her. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry I left. I should have trusted you. You did what you had to do. I don't blame you. Maybe you should. Maybe we all deserve blame for being so quick to believe the worst." Vivienne was quiet for a long time. Then, "Do you know what the hardest part is? Not the betrayal, not the scandal. It's realizing that no matter how much good you do, people will always be waiting for you to fail. Because failure is more interesting than success, and destruction is more entertaining than creation. That's not true, isn't it? Look at what happened. I spent months building something real, and it took one lie to destroy all of it. One forged document, one trusted person turning traitor. That's all it took. But you rebuilt it." "I rebuilt the buildings," Vivienne said. "I didn't rebuild the trust." She stood and walked to the window, staring out at the dark village. Somewhere out there, families were sleeping in warm beds because of her work. Children were eating meals because of her funding. Soldiers were receiving medical care because of her clinics. It should have been enough, but it wasn't. Because the cost of doing good in a world that punished compassion was slowly destroying her from the inside out. Bam! Nathaniel arrived in Lancashire 3 weeks later, unannounced. Vivienne was in the medical clinic, helping Dr. Harrison's replacement treat a child with a broken arm, when someone knocked on the door. She looked up to find her husband standing in the doorway. He looked completely out of place. Too clean, too polished, like someone who'd accidentally wandered into a world he didn't belong in. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "We need to talk." "I'm working. It's important." She finished setting the child's arm, gave instructions to the nurse, and followed Nathaniel outside. They walked through the village square in silence. People stared, whispered. Mothers pulled children closer. Everyone recognized the Duke of Ashford, and everyone knew his history with the woman beside him. Finally, they reached the edge of the village, where fields stretched out toward distant hills. "Why are you here?" Vivienne asked again. Nathaniel didn't answer immediately. He stood looking at the landscape, at the rough buildings and muddy roads and poverty that defined this place. "I came to apologize." he said finally. The words were so unexpected that Vivienne actually laughed. You came all this way to apologize? Yes. For what, specifically? Abandoning me? Humiliating me? Making my life hell for months? You'll have to be more specific, because the list is rather long. For all of it, Nathaniel said quietly. For every cruel thing I did. For every time I chose my own comfort over your humanity. For being exactly the kind of man my father raised me to be, even though I knew it was wrong. Vivienne stared at him. This was the first time she'd ever heard Nathaniel admit to being wrong about anything. What changed? She asked. You did. Or rather, watching you survive everything I threw at you changed me. I kept waiting for you to break, to give up, to prove that compassion was weakness, the way I'd always believed. But you didn't break. You just kept fighting. And somewhere in the middle of investigating your scandal, I realized something. What? That I've wasted my entire life trying to prove I didn't need anyone, and all it did was turn me into someone nobody needs. The admission hung in the air between them. Vivienne didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to rage at him, to list every wound he'd inflicted and demand he feels the same pain she'd felt. But another part, a quieter, more exhausted part, just wanted this conversation to end so she could go back to work and forget he existed. I accept your apology, she said finally, but it doesn't change anything. I know. Then why come here? Nathaniel turned to face her directly. Because I want to help, really help. Not the performative investigation I did before, but actual work. I want to fund your shelters, expand them, use my resources to make sure what happened to you never happens again. Vivienne studied his face carefully, looking for the manipulation she'd learned to expect, but all she saw was exhaustion, the same bone-deep weariness she felt every time she looked in a mirror. Why would you do that? Because I finally understand something you've known all along. Power without purpose is just noise, and I'm tired of making noise. They stood in silence as the sun began setting over Lancashire's fields, two people who'd destroyed each other trying to figure out if anything could be salvaged from the wreckage. Finally, Vivienne spoke. If you're serious about helping, I have conditions. Name them. First, you don't get credit, no announcements, no publicity. This isn't about rebuilding your reputation. It's about actually helping people. Agreed. Second, you work. Not from London, sending money and orders. Here, in the shelters, doing the same degrading tasks everyone else does. For how long? As long as it takes for you to understand why this matters. Nathaniel nodded slowly. Anything else? Yes. Stop trying to control everything. You spent our entire marriage trying to control me, control society's perception, control every variable in your life. It didn't work. It just made you miserable and everyone around you suffer. So if you're going to be here, you need to learn how to let go. The words struck deeper than Vivienne intended. She watched something shift in Nathaniel's expression. Not anger, not defensiveness, just recognition. Because letting go was exactly what terrified him most. His whole life had been built on the belief that control equaled safety. That if he could just manage every variable, predict every outcome, he'd never be vulnerable to pain. But Vivienne was living proof that control was an illusion. She'd lost everything, reputation, security, trust, and she'd survived anyway. Not because she'd controlled the situation, but because she'd adapted to circumstances beyond her control. That was real strength, the kind Nathaniel had spent 29 years running from. I'll try, he said quietly. Trying isn't good enough. Then I'll do better than try. Vivienne wanted to believe him, wanted to think that people could actually change, that cruelty wasn't permanent, that the man who'd abandoned her could somehow transform into someone worth trusting. But she'd been betrayed too many times to believe in easy redemptions. We'll see, she said. Back. Nathaniel moved into a small room above the Crosswell shelter 2 days later. The villagers reacted with everything from suspicion to outright hostility. This was the man who'd humiliated their Duchess, who'd paraded his mistress through London while his wife suffered, who represented everything they despised about aristocracy. Privilege without responsibility, wealth without compassion, power without purpose. They wanted him gone, but Vivienne had given her word, so they tolerated his presence the way you tolerate a necessary evil. Nathaniel started working the next morning. Thomas put him to work hauling lumber for a new shelter expansion. Manual labor, the kind that left your hands blistered and your back screaming. Nathaniel lasted 3 hours before he had to stop, gasping, his fine clothes soaked with sweat. "You're soft," Thomas said without sympathy. "Come back when you're ready to actually work." The next day, Nathaniel lasted 4 hours, then 5, then a full day. He didn't complain, didn't ask for special treatment, just showed up every morning and did whatever task he was assigned, no matter how degrading. He cleaned chamber pots, scrubbed floors, hauled water from wells, delivered food to families too weak to come to the kitchens, did every single brutal, thankless job that needed doing. The villagers watched him carefully, waiting for the moment he'd break, waiting for him to demand respect or comfort or acknowledgement that he was better than this. But Nathaniel never broke, because he'd finally understood something Vivienne had tried to teach him months ago, that real power had nothing to do with commanding others. Real power was enduring what needed to be endured, doing what needed to be done, and showing up even when every muscle in your body screamed to quit. Slowly, painfully slowly, the villagers began to soften. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. The grudging awareness that maybe this aristocrat wasn't completely worthless after all. Late one night, 6 weeks after Nathaniel's arrival, Vivienne found him sitting alone in the shelter's kitchen. He was staring at his hands. They were covered in calluses now, cracked, bleeding in places where blisters had burst and reformed too many times to count. They looked like her hands had looked when she'd first started building shelters. "Can't sleep?" she asked. He looked up, startled, then shook his head. "Just thinking." About? About how wrong I was. About everything. Vivienne sat down across from him. That's a dangerous realization. Thinking tends to lead to more thinking, and before you know it, you've questioned your entire existence. Nathaniel smiled slightly. Too late. Already there. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Nathaniel spoke again. "I met a boy today, 7 years old. His father died at Waterloo. His mother died giving birth to his sister last winter. He's been taking care of that baby for 8 months. 8 months. He's 7 years old, and he's already more of a man than I'll ever be. That's not true. It is, though. I've had every advantage a person could have. Money, title, education. And I used all of it to make myself feel superior while people like that boy were fighting just to survive. I didn't see them. Didn't care about them. They were just background noise to my important life. And now? Now I can't stop seeing them. Every family in these shelters. Every child who's hungry. Every soldier who's broken. They're all I see." Vivienne studied him carefully. "That's the cost of waking up. You can't go back to sleep once you've seen the truth." "Do you ever regret it?" Nathaniel asked. "Waking up, I mean. Wouldn't it have been easier to just stay in London and play the role of forgotten Duchess?" "Easier, yes, but I would have died inside. Slowly, piece by piece. Until there was nothing left except a beautiful corpse in an expensive dress. Is that what I was becoming? You were already there." The words should have hurt. But Nathaniel just nodded, because he knew it was true. Knew that the man he'd been in London, cruel, empty, performing wealth without purpose, was already dead. The investigation had killed him. Vivienne's survival had killed him. And what was left now was something unformed, raw, uncertain of its own shape. "Can people actually change?" he asked quietly. Vivienne thought about Margaret's betrayal, Dr. Harrison's desperation, Celeste's manipulation, all the ways people had disappointed her, all the reasons to believe that human nature was fixed and cruel and unchangeable. Then she thought about the villagers who'd forgiven Thomas for leaving, the families who'd welcomed her back after doubting her. The soldiers who'd learned to trust again after war had taught them that trust was suicide. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but I think we have to believe they can. Because if we don't, then what's the point of any of this?" The confrontation came in November on a day when winter arrived early and brutal. Snow fell in sheets across Lancashire, and temperatures dropped so fast that water froze in minutes. The shelters were overwhelmed, families packed into every available space. The medical clinic was treating dozens of cases of frostbite and pneumonia. Supplies were running dangerously low. Vivienne was in her office, trying to figure out how to stretch resources that were already stretched too thin, when Thomas burst through the door. "We have a problem," he said. "What now?" "Parliament. They're threatening to shut us down." Vivienne went very still. "On what grounds?" Safety violations. They're claiming the shelters are overcrowded and unsanitary, that we're creating breeding grounds for disease. That's insane. We follow every regulation. We're cleaner than half the buildings in London. Doesn't matter. They've sent inspectors. They're arriving tomorrow. Vivienne felt rage building in her chest. This wasn't about safety. This was about politics. About aristocrats who'd never forgiven her for making them look bad. About powerful men who wanted her to fail because her success made their own cruelty visible. Let them come, she said. We have nothing to hide. But when the inspectors arrived the next morning, Vivienne realized immediately that facts wouldn't matter. There were 3 of them. Men in expensive suits who looked at the shelters like they were examining sewage. They walked through each building, making notes, pointing out imaginary violations, manufacturing reasons to condemn months of work. The head inspector, a man named Thornhill, with a face like spoiled meat, stood in the main shelter and delivered his verdict. These facilities are unacceptable, he announced. Overcrowded, poorly ventilated, structurally unsound. I'm ordering them closed immediately. You can't do that, Vivienne said. These people have nowhere else to go. That's not my problem, Thornhill replied. I'm here to enforce regulations. And these buildings violate every standard we've established. Those standards were written for London townhouses, not emergency shelters in rural villages. The law doesn't distinguish between the two. Then the law is wrong. Thornhill smiled. It was not a kind expression. Perhaps. But I don't make the law. I just enforce it. You have until the end of the week to evacuate all residents. After that, anyone remaining will be forcibly removed. He walked out before Vivienne could respond. She stood in the shelter, surrounded by families who'd just heard their home was being destroyed, and felt something inside her snap, not break, not shatter, just snap clean through, the way bones snap when pressure becomes unbearable. She'd fought so hard, survived so much, built something real from nothing, and now men who'd never cared about anyone except themselves were going to destroy it because her success made them uncomfortable. It wasn't fair, it wasn't right, it wasn't acceptable, and she was done accepting it. That night, Vivienne called a meeting. She gathered everyone who mattered: Thomas, the remaining staff, village leaders, and Nathaniel. They crowded into the main shelter's kitchen, faces grim, already mourning what they were about to lose. We're not closing, Vivienne said. They all stared at her. The inspectors gave us a week, Thomas said. If we don't comply, they'll send constables to force everyone out. Let them try. You can't fight the government, one of the village leaders said. They have the law on their side. The law is wrong, Vivienne replied, and I'm tired of pretending that following unjust rules is the same thing as doing what's right. She turned to Nathaniel. I need you to do something for me. What? Use your connections. Call in every favor you've ever earned. Get parliament members here, journalists, anyone with influence. I want them to see these shelters with their own eyes before they're destroyed. Nathaniel nodded slowly. I can do that. Good. Because in 3 days, we're holding a public hearing right here. And we're going to force every person who's trying to shut us down to look these families in the eye and explain why they deserve to freeze to death. You're declaring war, Thomas said quietly. No, Vivienne replied. I'm forcing them to see the war they've already been fighting, against people who can't fight back, against children and widows and broken soldiers who've already lost everything. She looked around the room at faces marked by exhaustion and poverty and the brutal reality of survival. I know I'm asking a lot. I know the risk. If we fight this and lose, we lose everything. But if we don't fight, we've already lost. So I'm asking you to trust me one more time, to stand with me, to refuse to let cruelty win just because cruelty has power. The room was silent. Then Thomas stood. I'm in. One by one, the others stood too. Even Nathaniel, whose entire life had been built on avoiding exactly this kind of confrontation, stood and said, whatever you need. Vivienne felt something warm spread through her chest. Not hope. She'd learned hope was dangerous. But determination. The kind that lived in your bones and reminded you that some battles were worth fighting even when winning seemed impossible. 3 days, she said. We have 3 days to prove that compassion matters more than politics. 3 days to change everything, or lose it all trying. The preparations were brutal. Nathaniel worked his connections relentlessly, sent telegrams to every Parliament member he'd ever known, called in favors from journalists and reformers and anyone with influence. Most ignored him, some laughed, but a crucial few, agreed to come. Meanwhile, Vivienne prepared the shelters, made sure every family had clean clothes, every child was fed, every surface was scrubbed until it gleamed. She wasn't just preparing for an inspection, she was preparing for war. Because that's what this was, a war between two visions of England, one that valued power and profit above everything, and one that believed human beings deserved dignity, even when they had nothing left to give. The night before the hearing, Vivienne couldn't sleep. She walked through the empty shelters, past sleeping families, past children curled up in beds that might be taken from them tomorrow. She thought about everything that had led to this moment: her mother's death, her father's neglect, Nathaniel's cruelty, Margaret's betrayal, every wound, every loss, every brutal lesson about how the world worked. She'd survived all of it, but she didn't know if she could survive losing this. She found Nathaniel sitting outside, staring at the stars. He looked up when she approached. "Can't sleep either?" She shook her head and sat beside him. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Nathaniel spoke. "If this goes wrong tomorrow, it won't. But if it does, I want you to know that helping you these past few months has been the only meaningful thing I've ever done with my life." Vivienne looked at him, really looked at him, and saw someone completely different from the cruel aristocrat who'd abandoned her. This man's hands were calloused, his face was worn, his eyes held something that hadn't been there before. Humanity. The kind that only comes from suffering alongside people instead of above them. "Win or lose tomorrow," she said quietly, "you've already changed. That matters. Does it? Even if we lose everything? Especially then, because the only thing that separates us from people like Thornhill is that we tried. We saw suffering and refused to look away. That's not nothing." Nathaniel reached out slowly, carefully, and took her hand. It was the first time he touched her with actual tenderness since their wedding day. She didn't pull away. They sat together under the stars, two broken people who'd destroyed and rebuilt each other, waiting for a dawn that would either save everything they'd fought for or destroy it completely. And in that moment, Vivienne realized something. She'd spent her entire life waiting for someone to save her. Her father, her husband, anyone with power and resources and the ability to fix what was broken. But she'd been wrong. The only person who could save her was herself. And tomorrow, she'd prove it, or die trying. Dawn came cold and merciless. Vivienne stood at the window of her small room, watching light bleed across Lancashire's frozen fields, and felt the weight of everything she was about to risk settle into her bones. This wasn't just another battle. This was the final confrontation between two versions of England, one that believed power justified cruelty, and one that believed compassion was the only thing that made power worth having. She dressed carefully, not in silk or jewels or anything that screamed Duchess, just a simple gray wool dress. Clean, practical, the kind of clothing the families in her shelters would recognize as their own. Because today wasn't about performing wealth. It was about standing shoulder to shoulder with people who had nothing and proving that their lives mattered more than politics. By the time she walked downstairs, the shelters were already filling with people, not just residents. Villagers from across Lancashire had come. Farmers, blacksmiths, seamstresses, soldiers missing limbs, widows carrying babies. They packed into every available space, standing in the cold morning air with the quiet determination of people who'd been ignored their entire lives and were finally demanding to be seen. Nathaniel found her near the main shelter entrance. "They're here," he said quietly. "All of them? Most? 20 Parliament members, a dozen journalists, even Lord Cartwright came." Vivienne felt something flutter in her chest. Not quite hope. More like the dangerous possibility that maybe, just maybe, truth could actually matter. And Thornhill? Already inside, with 3 more inspectors. They're setting up in the main hall. She nodded and walked toward the building where her entire future would be decided in the next few hours. Let's. The main hall was packed. Parliament members sat in chairs arranged along one wall, their faces carefully neutral, already calculating how this spectacle might affect their political careers. Journalists stood in the back, notebooks ready, pens poised to capture whatever scandal emerged. And in the center of the room, behind a makeshift table, sat Thornhill and his fellow inspectors, looking like judges presiding over an execution. The family stood along the other wall, silent, watching. Their presence was more powerful than any speech Vivienne could have given. These were the people the government wanted to forget, the ones whose suffering was inconvenient, the ones whose existence challenged the comfortable lie that England took care of its own. Thornhill called the hearing to order. "We're here to determine whether these facilities meet the standards required for public housing," he announced. "Based on our initial inspection, they do not. However, the Duchess of Ashford has requested an opportunity to present evidence to the contrary. We will hear her testimony, review the facilities again, and render our final judgment." He looked at Vivienne. "You may begin." She stood slowly, feeling every eye in the room track her movement. For a moment, she was back at the Royal Winter Ball, standing in front of London's elite, while Nathaniel humiliated her. But this time was different. This time she wasn't alone. This time she had something worth fighting for. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice steady, "you've come here to judge whether these shelters meet your standards. Standards written by people who've never gone hungry, never slept in the cold, never watched their children die from preventable illness. So before you make your decision, I want you to see exactly what you're judging." She gestured to the families lining the wall. "This is Mary Thompson. Her husband died at Waterloo. She has 3 children under the age of 7. Before this shelter opened, she was living in a collapsed barn with no heat, no food, and no hope. Now her children are warm, fed, learning to read." She moved to the next person. "This is James Hartford. He lost both legs fighting for England. The government promised him veteran support. They lied. He was sleeping in ditches, begging for scraps, waiting to die, until he found this place." One by one, she introduced them, gave them names, faces, stories, forced the men in expensive suits to see them as human beings instead of statistics. Thornhill shifted uncomfortably. "This is all very touching, but it doesn't address the structural violations." "The only violation here is you," Vivienne interrupted. The room went silent. "You want to talk about standards?" she continued, her voice rising. "Let's talk about the standard that says a 7-year-old boy should raise his infant sister alone because this country sent his father to die in a war and let his mother die in childbirth. Let's talk about the standard that says veterans who fought for England deserve to starve in the streets. Let's talk about the standard that allows men like you to sit in comfortable offices and condemn buildings you've never had to sleep in." "Lady Ashford," Thornhill said sharply, "you're out of line." "No, you're out of line. You came here to shut down these shelters because they make you uncomfortable. Because their existence proves that the government you represent has failed. Because as long as these buildings stand, you have to acknowledge that ordinary people are doing the work you refuse to do." She took a step forward. "So, yes, these shelters are overcrowded because there are too many people who need help and not enough places willing to give it. Yes, they're rough. Because we're building with scraps and hope instead of the fortunes you waste on parties and portraits. And yes, they violate your precious regulations. Because your regulations were designed to maintain comfort for the wealthy, not provide safety for the desperate." Thornhill's face had gone red. "You can't speak to me this way. I just did. And I'll keep doing it until you understand that these people's lives matter more than your political agenda." Lord Cartwright stood from his seat among the Parliament members. "If I may," he said, "I'd like to speak." Thornhill glared at him but nodded. Cartwright walked to the center of the room and addressed the other officials. "I visited these shelters months ago," he said, "before the scandal, before any of this became political, and what I saw was something I've never seen in 30 years of government service. Actual help, not bureaucracy, not committees that meet to plan meetings about forming committees. Real, immediate, life-saving work." He gestured around the hall. "These buildings aren't perfect, but they're saving lives. And if we shut them down because they don't meet standards that were never designed for this purpose, then we're not enforcing the law. We're using the law as a weapon against people who can't fight back." Another Parliament member stood, then another. Within minutes, half the officials in the room were speaking in support of the shelters. Journalists were scribbling frantically. And Thornhill was realizing that his carefully planned political execution was collapsing around him. Finally, he stood. "This hearing is over," he announced. "We'll review the testimony and render our decision within the week." "No," Vivienne said. "You'll render it now. That's not how this works." Yes, it is. Because if you leave here without making a decision, you'll go back to London and let politics override conscience. You'll close these shelters to save face, to prove you have power. But if you decide now, in front of these witnesses, you'll have to own your choice. You'll have to look these families in the eye and tell them their lives don't matter. She walked toward him until they were standing face to face. So make your decision, Inspector Thornhill. Right now. Are you a man who enforces unjust laws because it's easier than fighting for what's right? Or are you someone who remembers that laws are supposed to serve people, not destroy them? The silence stretched out, suffocating. Thornhill looked around the room, at the families, at the Parliament members, at the journalists documenting every moment. He was trapped. Whatever he decided would define him forever, and everyone in this room would remember. Finally, he spoke. The shelters will remain open, he said quietly, pending minor improvements to ventilation and fire safety, which I'm certain the Duchess can manage within a reasonable time frame. The room erupted. Families were crying, Parliament members were applauding, journalists were shouting questions, and Vivienne stood in the center of it all, feeling something she hadn't felt in months. Victory. Not the hollow kind that came from destroying enemies. The real kind. The kind that meant people would survive another winter, that children would keep learning, that soldiers would receive care, that compassion had, for once, actually defeated cruelty. She looked across the room and found Nathaniel watching her. He wasn't smiling, wasn't celebrating, just looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Something between admiration and grief. Like he was seeing her clearly for the first time and realizing exactly what he'd almost destroyed. Look, the celebrations lasted well into the night. Villagers brought out whatever food they had. Someone produced a fiddle. Children danced. Adults shared stories. For a few precious hours, the weight of survival lifted just enough to remember what joy felt like. Vivienne slipped away around midnight. She walked to the edge of the village, to the same fields where she'd stood with Nathaniel weeks earlier, and stared up at a sky finally clear enough to show stars. She'd won. The shelters were safe, the families were protected. Everything she'd fought for had survived. So why did she feel so empty? Because winning one battle doesn't end a war, a voice said behind her. She turned to find Nathaniel approaching. Can't sleep? She asked. Sleep feels wasteful tonight, like I should be doing something more important. You helped save these shelters. That's pretty important. No, he said quietly. You saved them. I just stopped being an obstacle. He stood beside her, both of them staring at the stars. I've been thinking, Nathaniel continued, about everything that happened, everything I did to you. And I keep trying to figure out how to apologize in a way that actually means something. You already apologized. Words aren't enough. They never are. Apologies are just sounds people make to feel better about the damage they've caused. They don't undo anything. Then what do you want from me? I want to know if there's any possible version of the future where you don't hate me. The question hung in the cold air between them. Vivienne thought about the woman she'd been on her wedding day. Young, hopeful, believing that marriage could become real if she just tried hard enough. That woman would have given anything to hear Nathaniel ask this question. But that woman was dead, killed by neglect and humiliation and the brutal education that came from surviving betrayal. What was left now was someone harder. Someone who'd learned that love wasn't enough to save you, that kindness could be exploited, that the only person you could truly depend on was yourself. I don't hate you, she said finally. Hatred requires caring, and I'm too tired to care about what you did to me. That's worse than hatred. I know. Nathaniel nodded slowly. Then let me ask a different question. Is there any version of the future where we're not enemies? Vivienne looked at him, really looked at him. The man who'd abandoned her had calluses on his hands now, dirt under his fingernails, the kind of wear that came from actual work instead of performance. He'd changed. She could see it in his eyes, in the way he stood, in the quiet acceptance that he'd destroyed something irreplaceable and would spend the rest of his life living with that truth. I don't know, she said honestly. I don't know if people can come back from the kind of damage we did to each other, but I'm willing to try if you are. What does trying look like? It looks like you staying here, working, not because you're trying to win me back or rebuild your reputation, but because this work actually matters to you. It does matter to me. Prove it. Spend a year here, really commit. No trips back to London, no political games, just work. And at the end of that year, we'll see if there's anything left between us worth rebuilding. And if there isn't, then we'll separate officially, legally, completely. You'll go back to your life, and I'll stay in mine." Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. Then he held out his hand. "1 year," he said. She took it. Not a handshake, not a promise of love or reconciliation, just an agreement between two people who'd destroyed each other to see if anything could be salvaged from the wreckage. It wasn't romance. It wasn't even forgiveness, but it was honest. And honesty was more than they'd ever given each other before. Duchess. The year that followed was brutal. Winter hit hard. Supplies ran low. Illness swept through the shelters. Vivienne and Nathaniel worked 18-hour days just to keep people alive. There was no time for grand gestures or meaningful conversations, just the grinding daily work of survival. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted between them. It started small. Nathaniel learning to anticipate what Vivienne needed before she asked. Vivienne trusting him with responsibilities she'd never have given him before. They developed a rhythm, not romantic, not even particularly warm, just two people who'd learned to work together because the alternative was failure. Months passed. Spring arrived. The shelters stabilized. And Nathaniel kept his word. He stayed, worked, showed up every single day, even when exhaustion made standing feel impossible. People noticed. The villagers who'd once despised him began nodding when he passed, then greeting him, then actually talking to him like he was human instead of enemy. He earned respect the hard way, one brutal day at a time, proving through action instead of words that he'd actually changed. Vivienne watched it happen with something close to wonder, because she'd seen men make promises before, seen them swear they'd be better, do better, try harder. But promises were cheap. Action was expensive, and Nathaniel was paying the cost without complaint. One evening in late summer, almost exactly a year after he'd arrived, they were sitting outside the main shelter after a particularly difficult day. A child had died that morning. Pneumonia, despite everything they'd done. Sometimes the work wasn't enough. Sometimes people died anyway. It was the hardest lesson of doing this work, that caring didn't guarantee saving. They sat in silence, both processing the loss. Finally, Nathaniel spoke. "I never understood what you were doing here," he said quietly. "I thought it was some kind of performance, a way to make me look bad. But it's not, is it? This is just who you are." "Who I had to become," Vivienne corrected. "I wasn't born compassionate, I learned it, because the alternative was becoming like everyone who'd hurt me. Do you think people can unlearn cruelty? I think people can choose differently. Whether that's the same as unlearning, I don't know. Have I chosen differently?" She looked at him, at hands that had once been soft and were now permanently scarred, at a face that had once been cold and now showed actual emotion, at eyes that had once held nothing but indifference and now carried the weight of understanding what it costs to care. "Yes," she said, "you have. Is it enough?" "I don't know, but it's more than I expected." Nathaniel nodded slowly. "The year is almost up." "I know. What happens now?" Vivienne thought about the question she'd been avoiding for months. They'd survived a year working together. They'd built something functional, if not warm. But functional wasn't the same as healed. Respect wasn't the same as trust. And she still didn't know if the damage between them could ever be truly repaired. "I don't want a marriage built on obligation," she said finally. "I don't want to spend my life with someone who stays because of guilt or duty or political necessity. I'm not here out of guilt." "Then why are you here?" "Because this is the first time in my life I felt like I actually mattered. Not because of my title or wealth or family name, because I helped keep people alive. And when I imagine leaving, going back to London, back to empty ballrooms and meaningless conversations, I can't breathe. This place is the only thing that makes sense anymore." He turned to face her directly. "I'm not asking you to love me," he continued. "I don't deserve that. But I'm asking if you can imagine a version of our marriage where we're partners instead of enemies, where we build something real instead of just performing one. What would that look like?" "It would look like staying here, together, running these shelters, expanding them, using my resources and your vision to actually help people instead of just talking about it. You'd give up London completely?" "London never made me happy. It just made me powerful. And I've learned the hard way that power without purpose is just another kind of prison. Vivienne felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking, opening, like a door she'd locked years ago was finally willing to let light through again. She thought about the girl who'd married Nathaniel, who'd hoped he might learn to care, who'd believed love could fix damage. That girl had been naive, but maybe she'd also been right about one thing, that people were capable of change if they wanted it badly enough. The question was whether she was brave enough to believe it. "I need one more thing from you," she said. "What?" "I need you to answer honestly. Do you love me?" The question hung between them like a blade. Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. "I don't know if I'm capable of love the way other people define it. My father beat affection out of me before I could walk. My mother died before I could remember her. I spent my entire life believing that caring about people made you weak. So if love means grand gestures and poetry and the kind of passion that makes people stupid, then no. I don't love you that way." He paused. "But if love means choosing you every single day, even when it's difficult, if it means respecting you more than anyone I've ever known, if it means wanting to build something meaningful with you instead of just existing beside you, then yes, I love you. In the only way I know how. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even particularly beautiful. But it was honest. And honesty was the foundation everything else had to be built on." Vivienne stood slowly and walked to where Nathaniel sat. She held out her hand. "One more year," she said. "But this time we're not just working together. We're actually trying to be partners, to build trust, to see if what we have can become something worth keeping. And if it can't, then we tried. That's more than most people get." Nathaniel took her hand and stood. They didn't kiss, didn't embrace. Just stood together under the stars, two broken people who'd spent a year learning that redemption wasn't a destination. It was a process, painful, uncertain, with no guarantee of success, but worth attempting anyway. 5 years later, everything had changed. The Lancashire shelters had expanded into a network spanning 3 counties. Over 2,000 families had found safety in buildings that Vivienne and Nathaniel built together. The program had become a model for veteran support across England. Parliament had finally passed legislation guaranteeing aid for soldiers and war widows. And the work that had started as one woman's desperate attempt to matter had transformed into a movement. Vivienne stood in this main hall of the original Crosswell shelter, now renovated and expanded beyond recognition, and watched families celebrate the 5th anniversary of the day Thornhill had tried to shut them down. She felt arms wrap around her from behind. Nathaniel rested his chin on her shoulder. "You did this," he said quietly. "We did this." "No, you started it. I just stopped being an obstacle and started helping." She turned to face him. Their marriage wasn't perfect. They still fought, still disagreed about strategy and priorities and how to allocate resources. But they'd learned to fight as partners instead of enemies, to challenge each other without destroying each other, to build something together that mattered more than either of them individually. It had taken 5 years of brutal work, 5 years of proving every single day that change was possible if you were willing to pay the cost. 5 years of learning that love wasn't a feeling. It was a choice, made over and over, even when it was difficult, especially when it was difficult. "Do you ever regret it?" Vivienne asked. "Giving up London, the parties, the power." "Every day," Nathaniel said with a slight smile. "Then I remember what I was. Empty. Cruel. A man who had everything and valued nothing. And I realized I didn't give up power. I traded false power for real purpose." He pulled her closer. "Besides," he continued, "being married to the most admired woman in England has its benefits. Even if she still won't let me get away with anything." Vivienne laughed. Across the hall, she saw Thomas talking with Parliament members about expansion plans. Saw children who'd arrived as orphans now helping serve food to newer families. Saw soldiers who'd been broken when they arrived now teaching others how to rebuild. This was legacy. Not the kind built on bloodlines or inherited wealth. The kind built through sacrifice and stubbornness, and the refusal to accept that suffering was inevitable. Someone called her name. She turned to see a young woman holding a baby, the same woman who'd approached her years ago in Harrowsfield's muddy square, asking if she was lost. "Your Grace," the woman said, "I wanted you to meet my daughter. I named her Vivienne, after you." Vivienne took the baby, feeling the weight of a life that existed because she'd refused to give up, because she'd chosen to care when caring was inconvenient, because she'd believed that ordinary people deserved dignity even when the entire world disagreed. The baby grabbed her finger and smiled. And in that moment, Vivienne understood something she'd been searching for since her mother died. She mattered, not because of her title, not because of her marriage, but because she'd used whatever power she had to make other people's lives better. Because she'd survived betrayal and scandal and loss without becoming cruel. Because she'd proven that compassion wasn't weakness. It was the strongest thing a person could choose. But check. That night, after the celebrations ended and families returned to their rooms, Vivienne and Nathaniel walked through the village. The moon was full. The air was warm. And for once, the weight of responsibility felt bearable. They reached the fields where they'd stood 5 years earlier, making their fragile agreement to try. "What are you thinking?" Nathaniel asked. "That we survived," Vivienne said, "against every odd. Despite every betrayal, we actually survived. We did more than survive. We built something that'll outlast both of us." She looked at him, at the man who'd once been her greatest enemy and had somehow become her closest partner. The transformation hadn't been magical, hadn't been easy, had required years of brutal honesty and daily recommitment and the willingness to forgive without forgetting. "Do you think people will remember us?" she asked. "I think they'll remember the work. Whether they remember our names doesn't matter. It matters to me." "Why?" "Because I want them to know that broken people can rebuild. That cruelty doesn't have to be permanent. That even the worst damage can be repaired if you're willing to try." Nathaniel pulled her close. "Then they'll remember," he said, "because we're living proof." They stood together in the darkness, two people who'd learned the hardest way possible that real strength had nothing to do with domination. Real strength was choosing compassion when cruelty was easier, was showing up every day even when hope felt impossible, was believing that human beings deserved dignity simply because they existed. Years later, when historians wrote about the transformation of England's veteran support systems, they would point to these shelters as the turning point. They would write about the Duchess who refused to quit, about the Duke who learned compassion, about two people who destroyed and rebuilt each other until something real emerged from the wreckage. But in this moment, standing under the stars in a muddy Lancashire field, none of that mattered. What mattered was that they'd survived. What mattered was that they'd chosen to care when caring cost everything. What mattered was that broken people had found shelter, that hungry children had been fed, that suffering had been acknowledged instead of ignored. The work would continue long after they were gone. Other people would carry it forward, expand it, make it better. But it started here, with a woman who refused to be forgotten and a man who learned that being remembered required actually mattering. Together, they'd proven that redemption was possible. Not inevitable, not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. And sometimes possibility was enough. The forgotten Duchess had become the woman England would never forget. And the Duke who'd abandoned her had become the man who learned that love was a verb, not a feeling. Their story wasn't a fairy tale. It was something better. It was real. And in the end, reality was the only thing worth fighting for.